everyone, today I have another zipper skills tutorial for you. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to do what I call a boxy top or flat top no tab zipper for your bags. This style of zipper closure can be used on bags that have a top zipper closure that sits at the very top of your bags. So those are your patterns that are similar to the Pythagorean pouch, the Betty pouch, or various other bag patterns that are out there. If you have a bag that has a recessed zipper panel, you would not use this particular method for that. Though as part of the series, I will be showing you a similar style of recessed zipper closure that you could substitute on those bags. For this video today, I'm focusing on patterns that have the zipper at the very top edge of your bag pattern. It's important to note that if you are doing a bag that has D-ring connectors, you would not install them in the zipper like you would with the sunshine bag or the Clio crossbody, for example. That will be trickier to do with this style of zipper installation because the zipper does sit flat on top of your bag. The alternative option for your D-rings would be to place it in the boxed corner itself at the very top of your bag pattern. That would sit like this within that boxed corner itself. This style of zipper pouch that I have here uses the same method of zipper installation, but it has the same measurements at the top and the bottom, giving it the rectangular shape. For a bag like the Pythagorean pouch that has the wider base at the bottom, it's going to give you a slightly different silhouette, and it is worth noting that with this style of zipper installation, you are going to lose a small amount of your height and your width on your finished bag. So that can change the finished shape if you're substituting it on an existing bag pattern. So as a comparison, this version of the Pythagorean pouch is done with the zipper at the very upper edge, and you can see that the sides are pretty straight so that it has a uniform width all the way down. Whereas on this version, where I've used the flat top or boxy top style of zipper closure, some of the width is taken into the sides and some of the height is now sitting flat on top of your bag, so you lose some width and you lose some height compared to the original zipper method. So that's something to consider if you are going to use this method on your particular bag pattern. And as I said, if you were going to put D-rings in the seam where it joins to your zipper, you may want to move those to the ends here rather than have them next to the zipper because they won't sit straight. They'll be folding across the top of your zipper teeth. You can do this method without any tabs. It's fairly easy and it comes together very similar to how you would put together a boxy bag. For this particular example, this will eventually be a standalone tutorial, but I just wanted to show you how you would adapt the connector if you were going to opt for this style of zipper closure on your bag rather than the option that has the tabs. Or you could always put the D-ring connectors in the side seams if you wanted to do that too. This style is different to the rounded no tab zipper video that I made a few months ago because you do sew across the end of the zipper with this version. So this is another no tab option that you can implement on various different bag patterns. So let's get going. I'm demonstrating on the Pythagorean pouch and I have my pattern pieces cut and interfaced straight from the pattern at 100%. I have my fleece interfaced and fused to the back, and I've got slight cutouts at the corner there so that when I box my top corner, I'm not going to have any bulk from the fleece, but that is an optional step. If you are going to do that, you would use the same measurements as I'm going to show you for your top corners on your exterior and your lining on your fleece to make sure that that fleece is not in that top boxed corner. You will need your zipper tape, and you will want your zipper tape to be about 2 inches longer than the width of your exterior. So the width of my exterior piece is 8 inches or thereabouts, so my zipper tape is around 10 inches long. You can do 1 or 2 zipper pulls, and we don't need to use any tabs for this method of zipper installation. The first thing that we're going to do is mark in where our box corners are going to be. We're going to make the same marks on our lining pieces and our exterior pieces. So we will be doing this for all 4. And the first thing that we're going to do is draw a line that is parallel to the side of our zipper pouch 5/8 of an inch from the outside edge. You don't have to draw that all the way down, but you're going to do that on both sides. And then you're also going to draw a line that is 3/8 of an inch from the upper edge, just crossing over. And that is going to help us mark where our cutout is going to be. Because of the angle at the side, the same way as we would create a boxed corner at the bottom, squaring up this corner here, we need to square up the corner where we're going to be boxing the top. The way that we're going to do that is by drawing a line that is perpendicular to the side of our bag and crosses over where those first two lines that we drew meet. So that line's going to be 5/8 of an inch long, angled in from the upper edge, but it's squared at this corner. And then we need to do a perpendicular line coming from the upper edge, straight down, again to the point where those two lines meet. So this is our boxed corner at the top. If your bag has straight sides, this line will not be angled because it's perpendicular to the outside edge. So if that edge was straight, the line would be straight the same way as it is on my grid here. It's just because we have the angled side. So for example, on this style of bag, that's going to be straight coming in from the side. We're going to do that on all 4 pieces on both sides. So we're going to be marking out 8 corners, and then we're going to be cutting that boxed corner out. You can choose to do this by just drawing in the lines and not cutting out the boxed corner, which will allow you to make a smaller box. However, I find when I do that, it pinches the zipper in a little at the side so it doesn't sit as flat on the top of my bag, which kind of defeats the purpose of doing the boxy style zipper opening. Mark those corners on all 4 pieces, and you would use the same measurements to mark the corners on your fleece as well. Once you have the corners cut out on both of your lining pieces and both of your exterior pieces, we're going to draw in our seam allowance. I'm using a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch, which is 1/4 of the width of my size 5 zipper tape. It's important to get this seam allowance exact. If you are going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, then you're going to want to add an extra 1/16 of an inch to your top cutout. If you're going to use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to want to take 1/16 of an inch off. You don't need to draw that on your lining pieces. They just need to be on the side that you're going to have facing up. Take your double-sided tape and place a strip between the cutouts on all 4 pieces. We're then going to mark the center of each of our lining and exterior pieces and on both sides of our zipper tape. If you have trouble getting your zipper pulls on when your zipper is already sewn to your bag, you can go ahead and place your zipper pull now. If not, you can wait to put the zipper pull on once we have already sewn and top stitched the zipper to the exteriors and the lining, but before we sew the side seam of the bag. I'm going to wait to put my pull on. I'm going to check my zipper tape, and I'm going to mark the side that will be the back end of my zipper on the side that the zipper tooth is sticking furthest out, so that when I am putting my pull on later, I know which side to start on to make sure that my zipper is back in its original alignment when I place my pull. Working with one of your exteriors and one of your lining pieces, remove the double-sided tape from the exterior and then place your zipper teeth face down, matching up the center mark on the exterior with the center mark on your zipper tape. It doesn't matter if you're working with the exterior back or the exterior front right now. Press that down. If you like, you can baste this in place before you sandwich the zipper between the exterior and the lining. I'm just going to place my lining straight down because the double-sided tape is holding that into position. Match up the center again and press it along. So we have our exterior that is face down with our zipper teeth, and then our lining is face up on the back of the zipper tape and right sides together with the exterior. And what we're going to do is sew along the seam allowance line that we drew in at 5/16 of an inch. We're going to be sewing from one end, back stitching, sewing all the way to the other end, back stitching, stopping where the cutouts are. We're sewing through all 3 layers. I'm going to be sewing using my shorter stitch length. I am using my zipper foot so that I can get close to that zipper tape and sewing right on that seam allowance line. Fold the exterior and the lining away from the zipper tape, and you can press that with a seam roller or with an iron if you have heat-resistant material. I'm just using quilting cotton, so I can iron on that. I find this method of zipper closure works better with thinner materials because it does get a little bulky, but it can be done with vinyl. You can, if you want, place double-sided tape within that seam allowance to just fold those away from the zipper teeth, but if you press it down, it's not entirely necessary. Take your second exterior, and you're going to match the center of the exterior with the center on that zipper tape, the same as the first side, and press that along. And then place the second lining piece down. And you can see that the edge of my exterior, where the cutout is for that top corner, lines up with the lining cutout. And the same as the first side, we're going to be sewing from this edge all the way along to the other edge of the cutout, back stitching at the beginning and the end, sewing on that 5/16 of an inch line. Smooth the second side of the exterior and the lining away from that zipper tape, and check that you are happy with the spacing on either side of your coils. And now we can top stitch that zipper. Because we used a 5/16 of an inch seam allowance, there is just the ever so slight corner at the edge of the upper boxed corner, and that is where we're going to stop our top stitching. We're going to top stitch from one cutout, which you can see the angled edge here. So once it starts going straight, we're going to be sewing at 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge, from this point to this point here. You can back stitch at the beginning and at the end, because that will be hidden within your seam allowance. So we're going to sew this side, which will be sewing through the exterior, this seam allowance, and the first lining piece, and on this side, through the other exterior, the seam allowance, and this lining piece. Back stitch at the beginning, at the end, turn it around, and do the same on the other side. We are sewing through both the lining and the exterior. Because of the way that we're boxing the corners, we won't get pinched in corners sewing both together. It's important to keep the lining smoothed back from that zipper, so placing a clip at the lower edge and or at the sides can help keep that nicely smoothed out. Using a longer stitch length and a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch, I'm back stitching at the very end where that angles in, sewing along next to the zipper teeth, and then when the exterior is angling up, back stitching again, coming up, top stitching on the first side, and then do the same for the second side, making sure that I've got one lining and one exterior, and the other lining and exterior are out of the way. Once you've trimmed back all of those threads, it's time to place your zipper pull. Going to the side that I marked earlier, I'm going to open out my zipper tape about 2 inches, slide the pull first on the marked side, pinch it between thumb and forefinger, take the second side and slide it up until they meet. Then I will slide the first slide down, and when I feel them click, push from the back of the zipper pull and slide it on. And then I check the zipper teeth to make sure that the starting tooth is on the marked side and that there are no gaps. And if I'm happy, slide the pull to the middle. Once the pull is in position, we can sew our side seams. If you want to place a second pull, you would just place it at the other side now and slide it to meet the first pull in the middle. We're going to be sewing our side seams with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. The tail of the zipper can be trimmed off at this point if you prefer. I like to leave mine long because when you finish your bag, the longer zipper tape will tuck nicer down into the side of the bag. If you cut it off here, when you sew the boxed corner at the top, it tends to stick up a little more. When you have it long, it pulls it down and you get a flatter finish on your bag. However, it does make it trickier to sew this seam here. So if you have trouble getting up close, you can trim that off. Alternatively, you can use a zipper foot and draw in that seam allowance so you know that you're getting nice and close and that that seam allowance is exact. Working first with the exterior, we're going to sew the side seams. We are not yet sewing the bottom seam of the bag. It's important to leave the bottom seams open for now so that we can easily open out that top corner to box it up at the end of the zipper. Match up the upper edge where we took that little cutout and the bottom edge. Place a clip in between and do the same for the other side. You can start at the top or at the bottom. The important thing is making sure that the edges of your exterior are lined up and that your zipper tape is out of the way. And I've drawn in that seam allowance at the very top there so I know that I'm hitting my mark. Using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm using my shorter construction stitch length. Repeat for the second side. We're going to do the same for the lining, and it does get a little tight here because the first side is sewn. So marking in that seam allowance so you know exactly where you're going when you get to that tight spot near the zipper can be really helpful to get an exact seam allowance. And the more exact your seam allowance, the easier it will be to box that top corner. Pull the lining back from the zipper and then match up the sides and line up the bottom boxed corner. And again, if you're finding this tricky, you can just snip the end of your zipper off in line with this edge here. So we're going to be sewing this lining seam at 3/8 of an inch also. Keep that zipper tape out of the way as best as you can. Sewing both sides, leaving the bottom of the lining open for now. Back stitch. So down this edge. Just keeping that zipper tape out of the way. Sewing all the way up the top as close as I can get to that upper edge. It's starting to pull in a little. I'm going to back stitch and then I'm going to come at it from the other side. You don't want to catch your zipper tape in this seam. The second side is a little trickier because of that tail on the zipper, which is why I start with the exterior, so that the easier side is the one that is seen from the outside. If the lining seam is not as straight as you would like it to be. The lining side seam is also trickier to sew because it is top stitched to the exterior, so it wants to pull away from where that side seam is. Just folding it back. Then I'm going to flip it around and keep going from the top down to get that last little section. Once you have both of your side seams sewn for the lining and the exterior, trim back the very top of your seam allowance and any extra threads, just angling in at the top towards the zipper, but making sure you're not snipping any of your threads. And now we're going to box this corner. If you look at your zipper tape and fold your exterior, you can see that you have a nice flat edge here. That is because of the angle that we took when we made those little snips at the corner. You're going to fold the exterior and the lining out, just like you would if you were boxing the bottom corners of the bag, but now we are boxing the top corner, and we're going to be sewing across that zipper tape. We've trimmed back the seam allowance, but you can still butterfly that open, and you want to do your best to line up the side seam of the bag with the center of your zipper. I like to smooth that out so that it is nice and straight, and then place a clip at the side to hold it in place, and then repeat for the lining side, matching up the lining side seam with the center of the underside of the zipper. And again, you should have a flat line at the top here. Just clip that also. Double check your placement. And what we're going to do is box the top corner of the bag over the edge of the zipper, and that is what is going to give us that flat boxy top look on our finished bag. When you are sewing your boxed corner, you can choose to sew as close to this edge as you like. The closer you sew to the edge, the narrower the top of your bag is going to be. If you sew only about 1/8 of an inch from that cutout, you are going to have a width at the top of your bag that is much closer to the width when you just have your regular style of zipper installation. However, there's not a lot of seam allowance there. You can remedy that by not cutting that corner out. However, the zipper will not sit as flat at this stage if you still have all of that material here at the very edge. If you take your ruler, you can measure here, and if you sew 3/8 of an inch down, that is going to line up with the very edge of your size 5 zipper tape, and that is going to give you an upper edge of your bag that is 1 1/4 of an inch. If you want it to be narrower, you would go further up, knowing that the further back you go, the more that the top of your bag is going to be taking away from both the height and the upper width of your finished bag. So you can choose exactly where you want to do it. I find that the width of the zipper tape is a reasonable size to make your top corners, but if you want to, you can just do them with a very slight seam allowance so that the top of your bag is narrower. I'm going to demonstrate to you how that looks different. So I'm first going to box this corner at about 1/8 of an inch from the straight edge, and that is about as narrow as you're going to be able to get it here. If you want to go even closer to the edge, you can opt not to take those corner cutouts. However, you do get some bunching of that material at the top here, which makes it difficult for your zipper to lay flat. You want to make sure that those side seams are straight. I'm just going to draw in where I'm going to box that. So it's 1/8 of an inch from the fold. Make sure it's flat on both sides and it's lined up. And then I'm just going to sew from this fold here in my lining to the other edge of the fold and back stitch, and that will be boxing that top corner of my bag. Important considerations when you're boxing that top corner are that your stitch line is parallel to that boxed corner cutout, which is also perpendicular to the zipper tape itself, and that is going to give you a nice straight squared upper edge of your bag. You want to make sure that your seam allowance is the same on both sides, otherwise your bag will be lopsided. And assuming that your seam allowance is correct and that you have cut accurately, the width at the section of your bag where you are boxing the corner, so the actual length of that seam should be the same on both sides also. So whatever measurement it is that you sew along this inside boxed corner, so this is about 7/8 of an inch, is going to correspond with what the upper boxed corner size will be. So it's about 7/8 of an inch on this side. It's a little wider because of the bulk there at the corner as it's turned out. But that is what influences what the size at that outside corner will be. So when you're finished sewing, that is what your upper edge will look like on your finished bag. If you go slightly further down, you're going to end up with a wider top. So that's personal preference, how you want to do it. The further in you go, the more the sides will pull in and the top will pull down, because it's going to essentially tuck your corner in further the bigger box you take. The important thing is to match both sides, keep it nice and flat, and do your best to line up the center seam at the side over the zipper teeth. Clip it in position, and then you're boxing the exterior and the lining at the same time, making sure that you're catching both sides. You also want to be certain that your zipper pull is on, and then sewing along the edge at whatever your chosen seam allowance is. I'm going to match my first side, so that is about 1/8 of an inch, and sewing just along from the fold to the other fold, not sewing from the edge of the zipper tape, just the fold in the material. I've left these zipper ends long. You can trim those off if you like. The reason that I have left them long is because when I turn the corner out here, if I snip that zipper just beyond the seam allowance, it tends to poke into that side seam, and by leaving it long, it curves around and it doesn't stress that side seam at all. It is secured there. You don't need to tack that into the seam allowance, but it just gives a better shape at the end of that zipper because it can round over. If it's snipped, it tends to poke in at the end here. So that's why I choose to leave that long. That's also why I didn't trim it when we were sewing the side seams, even though it would have been easier to get to the top if I had trimmed it off. I wanted to leave it long so that I could have it curve over at the end. After I've boxed both corners, I just like to check that they are the same size. You can check with a ruler, you can check by folding them together and comparing where the seam is, and then you can double check by turning just the top part of your zipper out. You can check that again with a ruler, and if you're happy, we can then close up the bottom of the exterior, box these exterior corners, and then we can close up the lining to finish our pouch. Going to be sewing along this bottom seam at 3/8 of an inch, sewing all the way from one boxed corner to the other, back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Just the same as you would on any of your Pythagorean pouches. We're then going to box the bottom corners, so lining up the lower edge of the side and the outside edge of the bottom. Match up those seams. You can put a staple in there to help keep those lined up if you like, or you can baste first before sewing your full seam allowance to make sure that your seams are lined up. I've butterflied that seam because we butterflied it at the top. You can also nest those. I'm happy with how well that's lined up, so I'm now going to sew it with my full seam allowance. Repeat for the second side. When you're closing up the lining, you can do it the usual way by sewing part of the way in from each corner, leaving a turning hole, and then boxing your corners. Or you can do it the hybrid way, where you would turn it out now and then create the opening in your lining before boxing the corners. I'm going to do a hybrid way today. So I've already sewn my side seams, and I'm just going to sew one side of my lining bottom seam, back stitching at the beginning and back stitching at the end, sewing about 2.5 inches in, and then I'm going to box one corner, lining up those side and bottom seams. Then leaving the second corner unboxed and open, and that part of the lining open, I'm going to turn this pouch out. So I've turned that pouch out, and now what I'm going to do is do the turning hole hack method just on one side, pulling the bottom seam out over the side seam, clipping along as far as I can. And then I'm going to sew this. This is the bottom seam of the lining. I'm going to sew in, and then I will box the second corner. And once I've done that and I pop that corner through, I'll have a regular sized turning hole that I can then hand sew closed or sew closed using my sewing machine. I like the half hack method when I have a softer, smaller pouch. If I've got something that's sturdier, like when I did the sword dot kit, I think the wide opening bottom is really beneficial because of the materials used and the stiffness. So if you have a bigger project or something that's using vinyl, waterproof canvas, Decaville, any of those thicker materials, doing the turning hole hack, leaving both corners unboxed would be my recommendation. But for a smaller pouch like this, doing one side of your lining the usual way and the second side using the hack is a really good alternative to just the usual turning hole. However, you can't pin your linings if you do it this way. So if you do like to pin your linings in the boxed corners, consider that you may just want to leave the regular turning hole. Tuck that second corner in, and then you just have the usual turning hole. It's a bit smaller than it would be if you'd had to turn your whole bag through that rather than just popping through that last corner, so that can be nice. I like to press the fold there before I sew that closed, and you can choose to either use your sewing machine and just sew straight across the edge with a narrow seam allowance, or you can hand sew that closed just like you normally would. And then you tuck your lining in to your exterior, poke out your corners a little, and there you have your finished Pythagorean pouch with the Boxy-Top or flat top zipper closure. And if you like, you can put a little tab in the end here, like I've done on this one, either with or without a D-ring. If you add a D-ring, then you can obviously add a wristlet strap, or if you do two, a crossbody strap to it, or you can just have the tab there. You can do tabs at both ends. That gives you something to hold on to at the end of your zipper, and then you're all finished. As I mentioned, I'll feature this style of zipper closure in a couple of future tutorials, but for the Zipper Skills series, I'm demonstrating different methods using the same base pattern, the Pythagorean pouch, so that you can see how the different methods affect the finished look on your bag, and you can compare them to some of the other zipper method options that are out there. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.